My mother looked me in the eye at the lawyer's office and said I didn't need a single cent of the family estate because the army took care of my kind. She had no idea who was actually funding the estate. She didn't know that the signature on the secondary trust agreements, the ones keeping the family estate from collapsing under the weight of my brother's endless corporate failures, belonged to the very daughter she was discarding. For 12 years, I had been the silent scaffolding of that family. When the letters arrived detailing the restructuring of the estate after my father's passing, I expected nothing, because I had long learned that independence in our family was treated as a crime punishable by exile. My siblings, who spent their 20s and 30s treating the family accounts like personal slush funds, sat across from me in tailored suits that my previous financial interventions had indirectly paid for. They didn't see a sister. They saw an obstacle that had safely removed itself by wearing a uniform and living thousands of miles away on a base. They thought my silence was compliance. They thought my posture, rigid and disciplined, was the stance of someone who had accepted defeat. But discipline is not submission. It is the calculated containment of force until the precise moment its release will achieve the maximum strategic effect. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and the distinct, suffocating scent of generational entitlement. The lawyer, an old family friend who had spent decades helping my father shield his assets from his own poor decisions, wouldn't look me in the eye. He kept adjusting his glasses, his fingers tapping against the thick manila folder that contained the finality of my erasure. My brother Julian was smiling, a faint, twitching smirk that he always used when he thought he had successfully outmaneuvered someone. He had spent his entire life failing upward, backed by my mother's unwavering belief that her sons were destined for greatness while her daughter was merely functional. To them, my career as a senior logistics and procurement officer in the Army was a convenient eccentricity, a strange choice that saved them the trouble of supporting me, but otherwise carried no weight in their world of country club memberships and hollow social standing. They viewed the military as something people did when they had no other options, completely blind to the fact that the international supply lines, defense contracts, and regulatory clearances I managed every day held more actual power than their entire portfolio of depreciating real estate. But the true destabilization didn't begin when they read the will. It began when they realized what was missing from it. My father was a complex man, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He knew Julian was a liability. He knew my sister, Clara, was incapable of managing a household budget, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial holding. In his final months, terrified of what his dependency on Julian's failing defense contracting consultancy would do to his legacy, he had done something behind my mother's back. He had sought security. And in our world, security doesn't come from family loyalty, it comes from institutional leverage. He had bound the primary commercial assets of the family estate to a series of federal compliance agreements linked directly to defense infrastructure support, agreements that required an active, high-level security clearance and a verified federal custodian to remain valid. When my mother officially signed the document stripping me of my inheritance, she didn't just cut me out. She inadvertently triggered a non-compliance clause that automatically revoked the estate's eligibility to hold those federal contracts. They thought they were taking my share. In reality, they were cutting the safety line that kept them from falling into absolute financial ruin. I sat there, listening to the lawyer read the words that legally declared me a non-beneficiary, feeling the profound, freezing clarity that comes when the last remaining shred of emotional obligation is severed. There is a specific kind of freedom that comes from being completely rejected by people who are supposed to love you. It removes the burden of guilt. It eliminates the hesitation that usually prevents a person from protecting themselves at the expense of their family. As Julian leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension, and whispered that he hoped my service pension would be enough to keep me comfortable in my retirement, I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply took my gloves from the table, stood up, and looked at my mother one last time. She looked away, adjusting her pearls, unable to face the daughter she had just sacrificed on the altar of her son's fragile ego. I left that office and walked out into the cold afternoon air, the silence of the city street a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the boardroom. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't file an appeal against the will. Instead, I walked back to my vehicle, opened my secure laptop, and initiated a standard notification of status change to the Defense Logistics Agency and the regional office of the Judge Advocate General. I was obligated by federal law to report any change in my personal financial liabilities or asset associations that could impact my security clearance or present a conflict of interest. By removing me from the estate, my family had legally severed my connection to the corporate entities my father had tied to those defense agreements. They wanted me gone, so I let myself vanish from their ledger entirely. And with my departure, the structural integrity of everything they thought they had just won began to instantly dissolve. They had no idea that within 48 hours, the machinery of the federal government would begin moving to protect its own interests. Completely indifferent to the delicate social status my mother had spent 40 years trying to cultivate. To understand how we arrived at that mahogany conference table, you have to understand the invisible geography of my childhood. I was the eldest, the one who didn't cry when she fell, the one who brought home perfect marks not for praise, but to avoid the friction of being noticed. My family operated on a strict, unspoken economy of attention. Julian and Clara consumed it all through their perpetual fragility, while I was expected to be the reliable foundation that required no maintenance. My father was a man obsessed with legacy but terrified of actual effort. He inherited a modest manufacturing firm that he managed to transform into a defense-adjacent logistics supplier through sheer luck and the social connections of my mother's family. But as the years went on, the business became a shell, propped up by high-interest loans and increasingly desperate restructuring. Julian was groomed to take over from the day he was born, despite showing an absolute lack of aptitude for anything involving discipline or analytical thought. He was the kind of boy who crashed his first car and watched his mother buy him a better one the next morning, while lecturing me on the importance of conserving water in the house. I watched this dynamic with a quiet, detached observation that served me well later in life. I learned early that emotional displays in our house were a currency used exclusively by the weak to manipulate the weak. If I complained about the disparity, I was told I was strong, that I was resilient, that I didn't need the help. It is a profound form of psychological neglect when a parent weaponizes your own capability against you, using your strength as an excuse to starve you of support while pouring resources into siblings whose only talent is dependence. When I joined the Army immediately after university, my mother wept, not out of fear for my safety, but out of embarrassment. She couldn't understand why a daughter of her social circle would choose a life of dirt, uniforms, and rigid hierarchy. She told her friends I was doing administrative volunteer work for the government, hiding the reality of my commission because it didn't fit the narrative of refined, helpless elegance she projected. My father, however, saw an opportunity. As my career progressed and I moved into the specialized field of military logistics and procurement, handling multi-million-dollar supply contracts and managing the complex distribution of high-value federal assets, he began to see me not as a daughter, but as a potential source of institutional leverage. He would call me late at night, his voice hushed, asking for advice on compliance frameworks or wanting to know how certain defense contractors secured their positions on the Federal Registry. For years, I gave him standard, publicly available guidance, always maintaining the strict boundary required by my position. But 6 years ago, when his firm was on the verge of losing its primary operating license due to an audit failure that Julian had caused through pure negligence, my father begged me for help. He didn't ask for money, he asked for security. He needed a guarantor with an impeccable federal record and an active security clearance to co-sign the remediation framework that allowed his company to continue operating within the defense supply chain. I did it. Not for Julian and not for my mother, who still looked down her nose at me whenever I visited during the holidays, but for my father, who looked truly broken for the first time in his life. I signed the secondary agreements, attaching my institutional standing as a protective shield over the family's primary commercial assets. The condition, explicitly laid out in the corporate bylaws at the time, was that those assets would remain tied to a structured trust that ensured long-term stability and compliance. My father promised me that this intervention would be recognized, that it secured my place as the true guardian of what he had built. But my father died 6 months ago, and with him died the memory of his desperation. My mother, left with the sole executorship of the personal estate and blinded by her desire to secure Julian's financial dominance, immediately set to work rewriting history. Julian had convinced her that my presence on those corporate documents was a threat to his autonomy, a way for the military daughter to control the family's wealth. Together, they convinced themselves that I had done nothing, that my signature was a mere formality that any lawyer could have provided, and that I was using my position to bully them. They began to see my quiet confidence as arrogance, my emotional restraint as indifference. The months leading up to the reading of the will were a master class in passive-aggressive exclusion. I was excluded from the planning of the memorial service details that involved the extended family. I was left off email chains regarding the management of the property. And when I did ask for updates, I was told that things were being handled by those who actually lived nearby and cared about the family's daily life. They treated my deployment overseas as a voluntary vacation from family responsibility, completely ignoring the fact that the stability they enjoyed was directly linked to the professional credibility I maintained. I watched it all happen with a cold, analytical detachment. In the military, you learn to read the terrain before you make a move. You don't react to initial skirmishes. You wait until the enemy has fully committed their forces to an unsustainable position. My mother and Julian were moving their pieces into a trap of their own making, driven by greed and an absolute ignorance of the legal and institutional reality that governed their existence. The reaction from the regulatory authorities was as swift and indifferent as a falling axe. When a defense-adjacent asset loses its certified federal custodian due to an intentional restructuring of ownership, the compliance systems do not wait for an explanation. They do not care about family traditions or the social status of a widow in a wealthy suburb. The computer networks simply flag the account as non-compliant, and the automated mechanisms of enforcement begin to turn. Within 48 hours of my official reporting of the inheritance exclusion, the regional office of the Defense Procurement Bureau issued a formal notice of immediate administrative suspension to the family's holding company. I was back at my command post, surrounded by the familiar, comforting hum of operational efficiency when the first call came from Julian. I didn't answer. In my line of work, documentation is everything. Verbal exchanges are a liability when dealing with hostile or desperate actors. He left a voicemail, his voice lacking its usual smooth, patronizing tone. He sounded confused, slightly irritated, demanding to know why a federal compliance officer had arrived at the company's main warehouse with an order to halt all operations related to the logistics contracts. He assumed it was a bureaucratic mistake, a standard glitch that I could easily fix with a phone call to my colleagues in procurement. An hour later, my mother called. Her voice was sharper, carrying that familiar edge of maternal authority that she used whenever I failed to meet her expectations. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for the cold betrayal in the lawyer's office 2 days prior. She simply stated that Julian was experiencing an absurd amount of trouble with some government inspectors and told me to resolve it immediately. She actually said, "Tell your people to back off, Catherine. This is family business and Julian has enough on his plate without your colleagues making a scene." The sheer delusion of it was almost magnificent. She truly believed that the United States military and its regulatory enforcement branches operated at the whim of her social convenience. I replied with a single formal email, copying the family's estate lawyer. I stated that as I was no longer a beneficiary of the estate or an associate of the holding company, I had no legal authority, standing, or right to intervene in any regulatory or compliance matters involving their corporate entities. I added that any further communication regarding federal contracts must go through the proper official channels, as my personal involvement would constitute a severe violation of conflict of interest regulations. I hit send and watched the email disappear into the digital ether, knowing exactly what kind of explosion it would trigger in their camp. The explosion wasn't long in coming. The next morning, the lawyer himself called my office line. Unlike my mother and brother, he understood the law, and more importantly, he understood the precise nature of the trap they had sprung on themselves. His voice was tense, the professional composure completely gone. He explained that because my father had tied the primary commercial assets to the federal compliance framework as a condition for their operating license, my removal from the estate had effectively invalidated the entire structural foundation of the company's primary revenue stream. The firm was now in default of its federal obligations. The contracts were frozen, The bank accounts associated with those contracts were locked pending a full audit, and Julian's personal consultancy firm, which relied entirely on subcontracting fees from the main company, was facing immediate insolvency. "Catherine," the lawyer said, his tone turning desperate, "your mother didn't understand the technical ramifications of what she was signing. She was just trying to protect Julian's future management structure. We need you to sign a retroactive emergency custodian waiver. It's a simple document stating that you maintain an advisory oversight role in the trust despite the inheritance restructuring. It will lift the suspension within 24 hours." I looked out the window of my office, watching a formation of young soldiers marching across the parade deck in perfect, disciplined unison. Every single one of them understood that actions have consequences. Every one of them knew that if you break the rules, the system doesn't bend to accommodate your feelings. "The time for waivers has passed," I told him calmly. "My mother made a deliberate, legally binding choice to declare that I have no interest or role in the family estate. I have honored that choice by completely removing myself. I cannot and will not falsify a federal document to claim an oversight role that my family has explicitly stripped away from me in writing. But this will destroy the company, Catherine," he pleaded. "Your father's legacy will be completely gone by the end of the month. Your mother could lose the house if the creditors call in the personal guarantees that were tied to the business performance. Then I suggest Julian begins working on a restructuring plan that doesn't rely on the exploitation of a daughter who wasn't considered worthy of a seat at the table," I replied. I ended the call before he could respond. The moral tension in that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about the absolute refusal to allow myself to be used as a tool by people who only recognized my value when they needed a shield. They wanted the benefits of my strength while actively punishing me for possessing it. They wanted the security my uniform provided, but they wanted me to remain invisible while they enjoyed the rewards. That dynamic was officially over. The real crisis hit them 5 days later, and it didn't happen in the quiet confines of a lawyer's office. It happened during a scheduled regional defense industry symposium, an event that Julian had spent months preparing for, believing it would be his grand debut as the sole head of the family's corporate empire. He had invited local politicians, potential investors, and several high-ranking retired officers to a private reception at a luxury hotel near the base, intending to showcase the company's expansion plans. He wanted to prove that he didn't need his father's shadow, and more importantly, that he didn't need his sister's specialized military connections. What he didn't realize was that when a defense-adjacent company is placed on administrative suspension for compliance default, that information is published on the Federal Contractor Registry immediately. It isn't a secret. It is a public red flag that tells every prime contractor, every investor, and every government agency that the entity is toxic. I was required to attend the symposium in my official capacity as the Regional Director of Procurement Strategy. I arrived in my full dress uniform, accompanied by my senior staff and a small escort of military police officers who were coordinating security for the venue's official dignitaries. As we walked through the main exhibition hall, I saw Julian standing near his elaborate corporate display, surrounded by a group of local business leaders. He looked sharp, confident, holding a glass of champagne, gesturing toward a large digital map that displayed his company's projected logistics routes. My mother was there too, dressed in an elegant gray suit, smiling warmly as she conversed with the wife of a local congressman. They looked like the very picture of successful high society stability. Then Julian saw me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, turning to his group and saying something that made them look in my direction. He walked over to me, his glass held high, his tone loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Ah, Catherine. Nice of you to take a break from your administrative duties to join us. Mother is over there if you want to say hello before you have to go back to the office." It was a classic Julian move, subtly reminding everyone that I was just an employee of the state, a minor cog in the machine, while he was the captain of industry. I didn't answer him. Before I could even speak, the regional contract administrator for the Department of Defense, accompanied by 2 civilian investigators from the Inspector General's office, walked straight past Julian's display and approached our group. The administrator looked at Julian, then looked at the folder in his hand. "Mr. Julian Vance?" The administrator asked, his voice crisp and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the exhibition hall. Yes, that's me, Julian said, his chest puffing out slightly. If you're here about the secondary phase of the logistics contracts, we are prepared to, Mr. Vance, I am here to deliver a formal notice of immediate contract termination and a debarment inquiry. The administrator interrupted, handing him a thick red-stamped document. As of 800 hours this morning, your company has been removed from the active federal bidders list due to a failure to maintain a certified federal custodian with the required security clearances, as stipulated in your operating license. All current task orders are frozen, and you are ordered to cease and desist any representation of your company as an active defense supplier at this venue. The color drained from Julian's face so fast it looked like he had been struck. The champagne glass in his hand trembled, the liquid spilling slightly over the edge. What? No, that's impossible. There's been a mistake. My sister here, she's the officer in charge of. Colonel Vance has no legal association with your firm according to the certified estate records filed with the state probate court 48 hours ago. The investigator from the IG's office stated firmly, looking directly at Julian. In fact, her exclusion from the corporate structure is the precise reason your clearance has been revoked. You do not meet the minimum statutory requirements to hold these contracts, Mr. Vance. Your facility is currently being secured by regional authorities to prevent unauthorized access to restricted logistics data. The crowd around the display went completely silent. The business leaders Julian had been impressing slowly began to step back, distancing themselves from the immediate radius of a federal investigation. My mother, noticing the commotion, hurried over, her face a mask of sudden, sharp anxiety. What is happening here? Julian, what is this? Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. You did this, he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You set us up. You used your position to ruin me in front of these people. I did nothing, Julian, I said, my voice calm, level, and entirely audible to anyone standing nearby. I simply honored the document you and Mother had me sign. You wanted me completely out of the family's assets. You wanted total control without any interference from my kind. I gave you exactly what you asked for. The fact that you didn't understand the machinery you were trying to run isn't my failure, it's yours. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, horrifying comprehension. She realized in that exact moment that the daughter she had treated as an invisible, self-sustaining resource was the only thing that had been keeping her world from falling into the dust. Catherine, she whispered, her voice breaking, the sophisticated facade completely shattering. Please, we can fix this. We can go back to the lawyer, we can change the paperwork. You can't change the reality of what you did, Mother, I replied, looking her directly in the eye without a single trace of anger or malice. You wanted to find out what my strength looked like without you. Now you know, but more importantly, you are about to find out what your weakness looks like without me. The aftermath of that afternoon was a slow, agonizing slide into reality for them. They spent weeks trying to find alternative financing, trying to hire expensive corporate lawyers to fight the debarment, but the system doesn't care about social status or family pride. Once the federal government marks an entity as non-compliant due to structural misrepresentation, the doors close permanently. The holding company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 weeks later, and Julian's defense consultancy collapsed under the weight of immediate debt calls. They tried to reach out to me multiple times. There were long, emotional emails from my sister Clara, who suddenly discovered that I was her sister again when her monthly allowance from the estate trust dried up. There were late-night phone calls from my mother, her tone shifting from anger to pleading, then back to bitter resentment. She accused me of being cold, of lacking family loyalty, of putting my career and my rules above the blood that connected us. She still couldn't see the fundamental hypocrisy of her argument. She expected total loyalty from a daughter she had legally and emotionally disowned. The final meeting took place not in a boardroom, but at my command headquarters. My mother had driven down herself, bypassing the gate security by using an old dependent ID that hadn't yet been deactivated. She sat in the waiting room of my office, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the grand house and the social standing that had defined her entire life. When my assistant escorted her in, I didn't get up from my desk. I didn't offer her tea. I simply waited for her to speak. We are selling the house, Catherine, she said, her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on the neat rows of medals and commendations displayed on the wall behind me. Julian is facing a civil judgment for breach of contract from his subcontractors. He might lose everything. I came here to ask you not as a beneficiary but as my daughter. To help your brother, you have the connections, you have the money you've saved all these years. You can buy out the remaining assets from the liquidator and put Julian back in charge. It's what your father would have wanted. I leaned back in my chair, looking at this woman who had spent 40 years teaching me that I was only valuable when I was useful. My father wanted security, Mother, and he knew that Julian could never provide it. That's why he tied the estate to my standing in the first place. You broke that trust because your pride couldn't handle the fact that the daughter you looked down on was the only one who actually built something real. Are you really going to let us ruin ourselves over a piece of paper? She cried, her tears finally coming, though I knew they were tears of frustration rather than genuine regret. You didn't ruin yourselves over a piece of paper, Mother, I said softly, the finality in my voice bringing an absolute silence to the room. You ruined yourselves the moment you decided that my strength gave you the right to treat me like an outsider. You cannot exile someone from your life and then demand they build a bridge to save you when your own house catches fire. She stood up slowly, realizing that there was no leverage left, no emotional guilt she could weaponize against me. I had outgrown her system completely. I had built my own empire, my own family within the ranks of the people who valued discipline, honor, and accountability over hollow bloodlines and unearned privilege. She turned and walked out of my office, and as the heavy door clicked shut behind her, I felt the final, quiet release of a weight I had been carrying since I was a child. I was no longer the invisible daughter holding up a collapsing house. I was simply a guardian of the line I had drawn for myself. Would you have signed the waiver to bail them out, or would you have let the legal fallout run its course? Let me know below. Share this with a woman who built her own empire when her family refused to give her a seat at the table.